From your perspective, what are the main challenges for true inclusion and diversity in the education system?
Well, I think the main challenge in having what I would call full inclusion is really to do with finding environments that it can include children with a wide range of disabilities and special educational needs. But from my point of view, inclusion is not just about children with disabilities. It's also about inclusion for children from different social class backgrounds. It's also to do with having girls and boys educated together. And it's also to do with schools that are multicultural, that include children from diverse racial backgrounds and other dimensions of difference as well. I think there will always be a very, very small group of children, less than 1% of all children, who possibly do better in a special school environment. But I think it's very important that all other children are educated together. So more than 99% of children should be educated together.
The biggest obstacles in that matter, are they more of a social or an institutional nature?
It's probably a bit of both, actually. Children with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, whatever term is used in different countries, very often these children are excluded or are placed in some sort of special setting, or else are in some sort of behaviour unit within the school, so they're not in mainstream classes. And children with social, emotional and behavioural difficulties tend to be boys from poorer backgrounds. With regard to social class, I think in almost all societies, there is perhaps a growing tendency for middle classes or upper middle classes to take themselves out of the mainstream system into fee-paying schools. And I think that introduces a kind of social apartheid which is unhealthy. I think all children should be educated together.
What would it mean to have real inclusion?
Okay, well, in primary schools, we tend to be fairly good at inclusion. And I think it's probably to do with the fact that we have group learning, we have a lot of individualised learning. I think in secondary schools, we are less good at inclusion. These obviously tend to be divided by subject classes. The curriculum is divided into subjects. And instead of staying in the classroom, children move around busy schools all day. And for many children with additional support needs, this is going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult for children with autistic spectrum disorder, social, emotional and behavioural difficulties, just the pressure of having to deal with such busy environments. It might be possible for some children to be in the same class, but to be doing work which is appropriate for their needs, not necessarily the same as everybody else is doing. So I think differentiated curricula that's a very important route to inclusion.
How can universities adapt to provide equitable education for their students with disabilities or additional support needs?
So there has been quite a lot of progress on the inclusion of disabled students in higher education, not just in the UK, but globally, I think. Of course, institutions of higher education are academically selective. So that almost automatically means that students with learning disabilities are excluded. I think we've got better at making material available in accessible format, but students that I've done work with still often speak about the difficulties they've faced. Having sign language interpreters there for students who need that's quite expensive, and it's often not provided. I've found that many students depend on family members and the support they offer to gain access. So I think we need to again make sure that all the required support is available for disabled students, which is going to be quite expensive. Societies need to make that investment. The people who haven't been included are people with multiple difficulties, including social difficulties as well as disabilities.
How can institutions prepare their teachers to be able to face this situation?
One of the basic things is that in initial teacher education, there has to be much more of an emphasis on differentiating learning materials. In other words, producing learning materials that are appropriate for the particular groups that are being worked with. I think too many teachers at the moment assume that all the students in front of them are exactly the same. So they teach exactly the same thing to the whole class and expect the whole class to progress at exactly the same pace. And that isn't good for inclusion. However, I would say that most teachers want to be inclusive.
How much is the achievement of higher education affected if students have been part of an inclusion process throughout all the other levels of education?
Well, if children are included and go through a mainstream system and of course are successful, then they are likely to be successful in going on to higher education. Again, when our work with disabled students suggests that those who have the most difficulty are not the ones from middle class backgrounds, but disabled students from very poor backgrounds.
What are the basic rights they should have? Like how can these children be guaranteed an optimal development?
Most countries in the world, in fact all countries of the world, have signed up to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child. The vast majority of countries in the world have signed up to the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And these international treaties are very clear about the rights that should be enjoyed by disabled children and young people and adults. But the vast bulk of disabled children, young people and adults should physically, I think, be in the same space as other children and adults. The UNCRC Article 12 places a great deal of importance on participation. So that means that the voice of the child, including the disabled child, should be heard in everything, all important decisions that concern them. Adults, of course, have the ultimate responsibility for decisions, but the voice of the child must always be heard and must be very, very influential in the final decision.
What are the obligations of educational institutions in general to their students with additional support needs?
Well, the obligations of the institutions are to create the conditions which enable the child or the young person to be included as fully as possible. Institutions need to recognise that they have legal responsibilities to include, and inclusion does imply making reasonable adjustments and of course avoiding discrimination on grounds of disability. So reasonable adjustments would include adapting the physical environment, possibly the rules and regulations, policies and procedures, classroom interactions to make sure that the child or young person is included and feels included.
And how do these obligations relate to the obligations of the government education sector towards these students?
Obviously, this varies enormously by country, because in some countries or in some sectors, the school is an autonomous institution. In some countries, then it is the local authority or the government that is responsible for running the schools. So depending on the governance arrangements, it is the governing body that has responsibility for ensuring that provision. So the government has a responsibility to ensure the funding is adequate. The local authority needs to make sure that enough money is reserved for the children with additional support needs and disabilities. And then the schools have the responsibility to make sure that the money is used as wisely as possible to make the school inclusive.
What is the role of families throughout the various stages of the educational process around the inclusion of students with disabilities?
We can't expect children and young people to manage their education by themselves, obviously. Parents are very often very skilled advocates for their children. In most societies, most nations, parents have a legal responsibility to ensure their child receives an education. So obviously, parents have a responsibility, I think, to make sure that their children go to school or are receiving appropriate education, whatever the setting that they are in.
Do you consider the possibility of the incorporation of equal opportunities in education achievable?
I certainly do, but it depends very much on what is decided at government level, because I don't think we can have equal opportunities without a fairer division of resources across society. And I think in Mexico, you have high levels of social inequality. So in those circumstances, it's not really feasible to expect schools to offer equal opportunities to all children. So teachers can, of course, do their best to equalise as much as possible. But if there is massive inequality in the rest of society, then schools can only do so much to compensate for this injustice.
How could marginalized sectors of the population be able to access the same opportunities in education?
Well, I think we can learn lessons by looking at what other countries do. So in societies that are more equal in terms of the division of economic resources and social resources, we find that there is less inequality in educational outcomes. If you want society to have a fairer education system, you also have to work at having a more equal society in general.
What would the role of society be in general when dealing with the issues that arise in the process of inclusion and acceptance of diversity?
It is very important that we have laws that are enforced so that schools and other institutions are not allowed, they're prohibited from discriminating against disabled people. I think that the messages that are conveyed throughout society, right from the time when children are very little, accepting difference, valuing difference, ensuring that children have respect for each other, messages throughout society about kindness and understanding are quite important.
What do you think are like the main obstacles in the process of seeking equal opportunities in education?
I would say in most cases that inequality of access to resources is the main problem. The overall environment that is experienced by all children, not just disabled children, is critical.
What do you think is the student's role in seeking equal opportunities for other students with disabilities? Like, what is our role there?
We wouldn't want to go back to a time when support for disabled children and adults was almost based on charity. There was no state support. And so other students, particularly when they're encouraged to be kind, considerate and inclusive, should be encouraged to help their fellow students as much as possible. It is up to the state to make the resources available so that they are able, everybody is able, teachers, parents and other students, to support disabled students. It can't just rely on goodwill, basically. There needs to be underpinning resources to make it work.
Do you think it's possible to achieve proper inclusion free of prejudice and obstacles?
Yes, of course I do. That doesn't mean that everybody is going to achieve exactly the same thing at school. But I don't think there is any reason why we should exclude children and young people from education. We need to focus on producing greater economic equality as well as to facilitate greater inclusion in schools. I think the two things go hand in hand.